Welcome to Drowsworthy, where history's most dangerous moments become your most peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're exploring the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, a disaster so catastrophic that you definitely wouldn't survive it. But don't worry, the calm narration and gentle rain sounds will help you drift off while learning about how a single morning destroyed America's most beautiful city in less than a minute. If you love falling asleep to history's darkest chapters, subscribe for weekly bedtime disasters. Before we begin this journey through one of America's greatest natural disasters, why don't you dim those lights? Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle, steady hum. Get comfortable, because we're about to transport you back to April 18th, 1906, where you'll experience firsthand why surviving this earthquake would have been nearly impossible. Why you wouldn't last a day as a San Francisco resident on April 18th, 1906. Picture this. It's 5:12 in the morning on April 18th, 1906, and you're fast asleep in your bed somewhere in San Francisco. The city around you is quiet, peaceful, with only the occasional clip-clop of early milk wagon horses echoing through the cobblestone streets. You have no idea that in exactly 17 minutes, your world is about to end. You're living in what many consider the most beautiful city in America. San Francisco in 1906 is a marvel of Victorian architecture, a boomtown grown, fat and prosperous from gold rush wealth and railroad money. The city sprawls across 49 hills, its elegant mansions and grand hotels gleaming white in the California sun. But beneath your feet, something ancient and terrible is stirring. The San Andreas Fault, that great scar running through California like a healed wound, is about to tear open once again. Let's say you're one of the 400,000 people living in San Francisco that morning. Maybe you're staying at the magnificent Palace Hotel, with its 7 stories of luxury and its famous glass court where carriages could drive right into the building. Or perhaps you're in a modest boarding house in the Mission District, sharing a room with 3 other workers for 50 cents a night. It doesn't matter where you are, because this earthquake doesn't discriminate. Rich or poor, native-born or immigrant, everyone is about to face the same terrifying reality. The first thing you need to understand about surviving the 1906 earthquake is that you wouldn't have seen it coming. There were no seismographs to speak of, no early warning systems, no scientific understanding of what causes earthquakes. Some old-timers might have noticed their horses acting strange, or perhaps felt a few small tremors in the days before, but nobody understood what these signs meant. You would have gone to sleep on April 17th with absolutely no idea that you were spending your last night in the old San Francisco. At 5:12 a.m., you're jarred awake by what survivors later described as a deep, rumbling roar, like the sound of a massive freight train bearing down on you from underground. But this isn't just sound, this is the earth itself coming alive beneath you. The initial shock lasts only about 45 to 60 seconds, but those seconds stretch into an eternity of pure terror. If you're lucky enough to be sleeping on the ground floor, you might have a chance. But if you're on any upper floor, you're in serious trouble. The buildings in 1906 San Francisco weren't built to withstand earthquakes. Most were constructed of unreinforced masonry, brick buildings held together with nothing but mortar and hope. The moment that fault ruptures, sending seismic waves racing toward the city at thousands of miles per hour, these buildings begin to dance like drunken giants. Before we continue, if you like listening to these videos to wind down, fall asleep, or learn something new, you should check out today's sponsor, Audible. Audible has thousands of stories waiting for you from history, fiction, poetry, and more. And you can even set a sleep timer, so the story fades when you do. And as the channel sponsor, Audible created a special free trial for Drowsworthy listeners. Click the link in the description and take advantage of this exclusive offer. And thank you Audible for providing our listeners this free offer. You wake up to your bed sliding across the floor, slamming into walls that are no longer straight. The very geometry of your room is changing as you watch. Walls buckle and bow, ceiling plaster rains down like deadly snow, and somewhere in the building you hear the terrible sound of timber snapping like toothpicks. The beautiful crystal chandeliers that were the pride of San Francisco's elegant hotels become death traps, swaying wildly before crashing to the floor in explosions of glass and metal. But here's what makes this earthquake uniquely terrifying. It doesn't just shake you once and stop. The Great San Francisco earthquake was actually a series of shocks. After that initial minute of pure destruction, just when you think it might be over, the aftershocks begin. These secondary tremors can be almost as powerful as the initial quake, and they keep coming for hours, sometimes days. Every time you think you might be safe, the ground betrays you again. Let's say you manage to survive the initial shaking and make it out of your building. Congratulations, you've overcome the first hurdle, but your ordeal is just beginning. As you stumble into the street, you're confronted with a scene that witnesses consistently described as resembling the end of the world. The streets themselves have become alien landscapes. What were once smooth, well-maintained roadways are now cracked and buckled, with fissures running down their centers like massive zippers. Streetcar tracks are twisted into impossible shapes, curling up out of the ground like metal ribbons. The beautiful cobblestones that gave San Francisco its distinctive character have been tossed about like pebbles, creating treacherous, ankle-breaking terrain. Everywhere you look, buildings are collapsing or have already collapsed. The elegant Victorian mansions that once lined the hills are now piles of kindling and broken glass. The magnificent City Hall, with its grand dome that was supposed to rival the Capitol in Washington, has pancaked in on itself, its beautiful facade now a heap of rubble and twisted metal. Years of construction were destroyed in less than a minute. But perhaps the most terrifying sight is the people. Thousands of your fellow San Franciscans are stumbling through the streets in their nightclothes, many of them injured, bleeding, and in shock. Some are carrying whatever possessions they managed to grab. Others are empty-handed, having fled with nothing but their lives. Children are crying for parents who may be trapped under tons of debris. The elderly and infirm, who had no chance of escaping quickly enough, are simply gone. And then, just when you think things can't get worse, you smell something that chills your blood. Smoke. The earthquake has ruptured gas lines throughout the city. Broken electrical wires are sparking. Overturned stoves and oil lamps have ignited whatever combustible material they can find. Within hours of the earthquake, San Francisco is beginning to burn, and these aren't just ordinary fires. These are conflagrations, massive walls of flame that will eventually consume over 28,000 buildings and leave more than half the city in ashes. Here's where your situation becomes truly desperate. The earthquake hasn't just destroyed buildings, it's also destroyed the city's ability to fight fires. The water mains are broken. The beautiful fountains and ornate fire hydrants that once dotted the city are now useless decoration. Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan, the one man who might have been able to organize an effective response, was killed when the earthquake brought down a chimney onto the firehouse where he slept. So now you're not just dealing with the aftermath of a massive earthquake, you're facing an advancing wall of fire with no organized firefighting capability. The few fire engines that survived the earthquake are running out of water within hours. Desperate firefighters begin using salt water pumped from the bay, but it's not nearly enough to stop the inferno that's consuming the city. As the fires spread, they create their own weather systems. The intense heat generates massive updrafts that can pick up burning debris and carry it for blocks, starting new fires wherever it lands. The air becomes so hot and thick with smoke that breathing becomes a struggle. Your eyes water constantly, your throat burns, and every breath feels like you're inhaling ground glass. If you're thinking you'll just evacuate to safety, think again. This is 1906. Remember, there are no emergency broadcast systems, no coordinated evacuation plans, no modern transportation infrastructure. The earthquake has knocked out telephone and telegraph lines, so there's no way to communicate with the outside world or even with people in other parts of the city. The cable car system, San Francisco's primary means of public transportation, has been completely destroyed. Most of the horses are either dead, injured, or so panicked they're useless. Your options for escape are severely limited. If you're lucky enough to live near the waterfront, you might be able to make it to the docks and catch a ferry across the bay. But the docks themselves have been heavily damaged, and many of the ferries have been pressed into service, rescuing people from burning buildings. The roads leading out of the city are clogged with refugees, carrying whatever they can save, moving at a painfully slow pace on foot. And here's something that makes the situation even more dire. If you're not a white, English-speaking person, your chances of survival have just dropped dramatically. In 1906 San Francisco, Chinese immigrants are confined to Chinatown, a densely packed area of wooden buildings that goes up like a tinderbox. When the fires reach Chinatown, as they inevitably do, most escape routes are blocked by collapsed buildings or advancing flames. The Chinese residents, many of whom speak no English, receive little help from authorities and are often left to fend for themselves. Similarly, if you're one of the thousands of recent immigrants from Ireland, Italy, or Germany living in the crowded tenements south of Market Street, you're in one of the most dangerous areas of the city. These neighborhoods, built quickly and cheaply to house the city's growing working-class population, are among the first to be consumed by the fires. But let's say you're more fortunate. Maybe you're staying in one of the grand hotels on Nob Hill, or living in one of the beautiful mansions in Pacific Heights. Surely the wealthy neighborhoods will be better protected, right? Wrong. The earthquake and fire are great equalizers. The magnificent Palace Hotel, pride of the city and supposedly fireproof, burns for 3 days. The mansions of the railroad barons and mining millionaires, with their imported marble and expensive furnishings, provide excellent fuel for the advancing flames. If you're one of the wealthy residents, you might have a slightly better chance of escape because you can afford a private carriage or automobile, though there were fewer than 1,000 cars in the entire city in 1906. But even then, the roads are so clogged with debris and refugees that motorized transportation is often slower than walking. As the day progresses, the situation continues to deteriorate. The fires are spreading faster than people can flee. Military troops, called in to maintain order, sometimes make things worse by using dynamite to try to create fire breaks. Unfortunately, most of the soldiers have no experience with explosives, and their efforts often just spread the fires further by scattering burning debris over wider areas. By evening, if you've somehow managed to survive the earthquake, avoid the fires, and make it to one of the refugee camps being set up in Golden Gate Park or the Presidio, you're facing a new set of challenges. These camps are overcrowded, unsanitary, and poorly supplied. There's not enough food, not enough clean water, and certainly not enough medical care for the thousands of injured people streaming in. The temporary shelters are little more than canvas tents or crude wooden shacks that offer minimal protection from the elements. Remember, this is April in San Francisco, which means cold, damp nights. You're probably still wearing whatever night clothes you escaped in, assuming you managed to grab anything at all. Hypothermia becomes a real threat, especially for children and the elderly. Disease is another major concern in these refugee camps, with thousands of people crowded together in unsanitary conditions. Typhoid, dysentery, and other infectious diseases spread quickly. The city's hospitals have either been destroyed or are so overwhelmed that they can't provide adequate care. Many people who survived the earthquake and fires succumb to disease in the weeks that follow. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters. Now, let's get back to the earthquake. Food becomes increasingly scarce as the days pass. The earthquake and fires have destroyed most of the city's food storage and distribution systems. Supply lines from the outside are slow to be established, and when relief supplies do arrive, they're often inadequate for the massive number of people in need. Bread lines stretch for blocks, and fights sometimes break out over basic necessities. Perhaps most psychologically devastating is watching your entire world disappear. San Francisco in 1906 wasn't just a city, it was a unique culture, a way of life that had developed over 50 years since the gold rush. The earthquake and fires didn't just destroy buildings, they obliterated an entire era. The theaters where you enjoyed evenings of entertainment, the restaurants where you dined, the shops where you bought your clothes, the offices where you worked, all of it is gone, reduced to ash and rubble. The human cost is staggering. Official death tolls from the 1906 earthquake are notoriously underreported, with authorities claiming only a few hundred deaths. Modern historians estimate the actual death toll was probably between 3,000 and 10,000 people. But these numbers don't capture the full scope of human suffering. Hundreds of thousands of people lost everything they owned. Families were separated in the chaos, and some members were never found. Children were orphaned, elderly people died from exposure and shock, and countless people suffered injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The earthquake also revealed the darker side of human nature. While there were many stories of heroism and mutual aid, there were also incidents of looting, profiteering, and discrimination. Some landlords tried to charge exorbitant rents for damaged properties. Merchants inflated prices for basic necessities. Insurance companies found ways to avoid paying claims, often arguing that damage was caused by fire rather than earthquake, since fire damage wasn't covered under most policies. For those who did survive, the trauma lasted for years. Many survivors reported being unable to sleep properly for months, jerking awake at the slightest sound or movement. The constant aftershocks, which continued for weeks after the main earthquake, kept everyone on edge. Some people developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though it wasn't understood or treated at the time. The rebuilding process was slow and often frustrating. While civic leaders promoted the idea of building a better, more beautiful city from the ashes, the reality was often quite different. Many of the same mistakes were repeated. Buildings were again constructed without adequate earthquake protections. Chinatown was rebuilt in essentially the same location and configuration, despite the obvious fire hazards. So there you have it, the first harsh reality of why you wouldn't survive the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. It wasn't just the initial shaking, devastating as that was. It was the perfect storm of circumstances that followed. The fires, the lack of emergency services, the breakdown of social order, the inadequate relief efforts, and the simple fact that in 1906, people just didn't understand how to prepare for or respond to such a massive disaster. The earthquake revealed how fragile civilization really is, how quickly order can turn to chaos, when the very ground beneath our feet betrays us. In less than a minute, one of America's most prosperous and beautiful cities, was reduced to rubble and ash, and the survivors were left to face a series of challenges that would test every aspect of their physical and mental endurance. The financial implications of surviving this disaster would have been equally devastating. In 1906, there was no federal disaster relief, no FEMA, no social safety net to catch you when your world collapsed. If you were a business owner, your store, your inventory, your livelihood could be reduced to ash in a matter of hours, with no guarantee that insurance would cover your losses. Many policies specifically excluded earthquake damage, and even those that didn't often became subjects of lengthy legal battles as insurance companies tried to argue that the damage was caused by fire, not the earthquake itself. If you were a renter, which most San Franciscans were, you faced the cruel irony of still owing rent on apartments that no longer existed. Landlords, desperate to recover their own losses, often demanded payment even from tenants whose homes had been destroyed. With no legal protections for renters and no alternative housing available, many people found themselves not just homeless, but financially ruined through no fault of their own. The employment situation was equally grim. Most jobs in 1906 San Francisco were tied to the city's physical infrastructure. If you worked in one of the downtown office buildings, those buildings were now piles of rubble. If you were employed in the bustling port district, the wharves and warehouses were damaged or destroyed. Even if your workplace somehow survived the initial earthquake, the advancing fires often claimed it within days. For those who depended on day labor, common dock work, or street vending, the destruction of the city meant the immediate disappearance of economic opportunities. There was no unemployment insurance, no welfare system, no government programs to help displaced workers. Your survival depended entirely on your own resources, the charity of others, or your ability to find some form of work in the chaotic aftermath. Women faced particular challenges in this disaster. In 1906, most women had limited legal rights and economic opportunities. If you were a married woman, you likely had no independent income or property rights. If your husband was killed or injured in the earthquake, you suddenly found yourself responsible for your family's survival with no marketable skills and few legal protections. Widows often had to choose between accepting charity, which came with strict moral conditions, or taking whatever work they could find, often under exploitative conditions. Single women faced different but equally difficult circumstances. Many worked as domestic servants, seamstresses, or in other service industries that disappeared along with the city's infrastructure. The refugee camps offered little privacy or safety for women, and reports of harassment and assault were not uncommon, though they were rarely officially acknowledged or addressed. Children, of course, suffered enormously during this catastrophe. In an era before child labor laws, many children contributed to their family's income through various forms of work. The destruction of the city meant not only the loss of their homes and schools, but also the disappearance of their economic contributions to family survival. Orphaned children faced particularly bleak prospects, as the city's orphanages were either destroyed or overwhelmed with new arrivals. The psychological toll on children was severe and long-lasting. Many developed what we now understand as trauma-related disorders. But in 1906, these were often dismissed as character weaknesses or moral failings. Children who wet their beds, had nightmares, or exhibited behavioral problems were more likely to be punished than treated. The concept of childhood trauma was not well understood, and there were no specialized services to help young survivors cope with what they had experienced. Educational opportunities virtually disappeared in the immediate aftermath. Schools were destroyed, teachers were displaced, and families were too focused on basic survival to worry about education. For many children, the earthquake marked the effective end of their formal schooling, limiting their future opportunities and perpetuating cycles of poverty. The medical realities of surviving the 1906 earthquake were particularly harsh. This was an era before antibiotics, before modern surgical techniques, before many of the medical advances we take for granted. If you were injured in the earthquake, your chances of receiving adequate medical care were slim. Most of the city's hospitals were either destroyed or severely damaged. Medical supplies were in short supply, and many doctors and nurses were themselves victims of the disaster. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening in the unsanitary conditions of the refugee camps. A simple cut or scrape, common when scrambling through debris, could easily become infected in an environment where clean water was scarce and proper wound care was nearly impossible. Broken bones, without proper setting and care, often healed incorrectly, leaving survivors with permanent disabilities that would affect their ability to work and support themselves for the rest of their lives. But this is only the beginning of our story. The earthquake itself was just the opening act in a drama of destruction and human resilience that would play out over days, weeks, and years. As we'll see in our next segment, even as the city burned around them, remarkable individuals emerged from the chaos to fight against seemingly impossible odds. The unlikely hero, General Frederick Funston, and the battle to save a city. As San Francisco burned around him on the morning of April 18, 1906, one man found himself thrust into a position of extraordinary responsibility. His name was Frederick Funston, and at 41 years old, this compact, bantam-sized general would become the unlikely savior of what remained of America's most beautiful city. His story is one of quick thinking, controversial decisions, and the kind of leadership that emerges only in humanity's darkest hours. Frederick Funston was not supposed to be the man in charge when disaster struck San Francisco. He was a brigadier general in the United States Army, commander of the Presidio military base, but he had no official authority over civilian matters in the city. Yet when the earthquake destroyed the city's government infrastructure and killed key officials, including Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan, someone had to step into the vacuum of leadership. That someone was Funston, and his decisions in the hours and days following the earthquake would determine whether San Francisco survived or burned completely to the ground. Funston was an unlikely candidate for heroism. Born in Kansas in 1865, he stood only 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed barely 140 pounds. His contemporaries often described him as looking more like a clerk than a military commander, but appearances were deceiving. This small man had already lived several extraordinary lives by the time he found himself facing the greatest crisis of his career. Before joining the army, Funston had been a botanist, exploring the remote regions of Alaska and Death Valley in search of rare plant specimens. He had survived encounters with grizzly bears, near starvation in the wilderness, and temperatures that would kill most men. These experiences had forged him into someone who thrived under pressure and thought clearly when others panicked. His military career had been equally remarkable. During the Spanish-American War, he had led volunteer troops in the Philippines with such distinction that he was promoted from colonel to brigadier general in just 2 years, an almost unprecedented rise through the ranks. He had personally captured the Philippine revolutionary leader Emilio Aguinaldo, ending a major phase of the Philippine-American War. By 1906, he was considered one of the Army's most capable field commanders, but nothing in Funston's background had prepared him for what he woke up to on April 18, 1906. The earthquake struck at 5:12 a.m., and Funston, staying at his quarters in the Presidio, was thrown from his bed by the violent shaking. His first thought wasn't for his own safety, but for the city beyond the gates of the military base. As soon as the shaking stopped, he climbed to the highest point he could find and looked out over San Francisco. What he saw filled him with dread. Smoke was already rising from dozens of locations throughout the city. The beautiful downtown district was partially collapsed, and fires were spreading rapidly through the wooden buildings that made up most of San Francisco's residential areas. Even from miles away, he could see that this was not a disaster that local authorities could handle alone. Here's where Funston made the first of many crucial decisions that would define his legacy. Without waiting for orders from Washington, without consulting with civilian authorities, he immediately mobilized every available soldier under his command. Within an hour of the earthquake, troops from the Presidio were marching into the city to assist with rescue operations and crowd control. This decision was technically illegal. Under the Posse Comitatus Act, federal troops could not be used for domestic law enforcement without explicit authorization from the President or Congress. But Funston understood that by the time proper authorization could be obtained, San Francisco might no longer exist. He was willing to risk his career, possibly even court-martial, to save the city. Funston's troops immediately began evacuating people from collapsed buildings and fighting the spreading fires. But the general quickly realized that conventional firefighting methods were useless. The earthquake had broken the city's water mains, leaving the fire department with no way to combat the flames. Something more drastic was needed. This is where Funston made his most controversial decision. He authorized the use of dynamite to create fire breaks by destroying buildings in the path of the advancing flames. The theory was sound. Remove the fuel and the fire would have nothing to consume. But the execution was fraught with danger. Most of his soldiers had no experience with explosives, and dynamite was a notoriously unpredictable tool for creating controlled demolitions. The results were mixed at best. In some cases, the explosions successfully created barriers that stopped the fire's advance. But in others, the blasts simply scattered burning debris over a wider area, actually spreading the flames. Some historians argue that Funston's use of dynamite ultimately caused more damage than it prevented. But in the chaos of that first day, with limited options and no time for careful planning, it seemed like the only choice available. As the fires continued to spread, despite these efforts, Funston made another crucial decision. He ordered his troops to begin evacuating the entire downtown area, effectively abandoning the financial and commercial heart of San Francisco to save the residential neighborhoods where most people lived. This was strategic triage on an urban scale, accepting the loss of buildings to save lives. The evacuation was a massive undertaking. Thousands of people needed to be moved quickly and safely through streets clogged with debris and threatened by advancing flames. Funston organized his troops into small units, each responsible for a specific area of the city. They went door to door, sometimes literally carrying elderly and infirm residents to safety. But Funston's challenges weren't just logistical, they were also political. As word of the disaster spread, civilian officials who had survived the earthquake began to assert their authority. Major Eugene Schmitz, though his city hall was destroyed, demanded that military operations be placed under civilian control. This put Funston in an impossible position. He needed to maintain his authority to respond effectively to the crisis, but he also had to navigate the complex politics of civil-military relations. Funston's solution was characteristically direct. He essentially ignored the political complications and focused on saving lives. When civilian officials questioned his authority, he politely listened to their concerns and then continued doing whatever he thought was necessary to combat the disaster. This pragmatic approach sometimes created conflicts, but it also allowed him to respond quickly to rapidly changing conditions. One of Funston's most significant contributions was his ability to maintain order in a city that was rapidly descending into chaos. As news of the disaster spread, opportunists began looting abandoned buildings and taking advantage of the breakdown in law enforcement. Funston declared martial law and authorized his troops to shoot looters on sight. This harsh measure was controversial, but it helped prevent the complete breakdown of civil order. The general also had to manage the massive refugee crisis that was developing as hundreds of thousands of San Franciscans fled their homes. He ordered the establishment of refugee camps in Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, and other open areas, and organized the distribution of food, water, and medical supplies. These camps housed over 200,000 people at their peak, essentially creating temporary cities that required their own infrastructure and governance. Perhaps most impressively, Funston managed to coordinate relief efforts with minimal communication infrastructure. The earthquake had knocked out telephone and telegraph lines, making it nearly impossible to communicate with the outside world or even with different parts of the city. Funston established a network of military messengers who carried orders and reports on horseback and on foot, creating an improvised command structure that allowed him to maintain control over his scattered forces. As the crisis continued into its second and third days, Funston faced a new challenge: the arrival of officials and relief supplies from outside the city. The federal government, state authorities, and private relief organizations all wanted to coordinate their efforts through different channels, creating confusion and inefficiency. Funston had to balance the need for outside help with the practical necessity of maintaining unified command over the emergency response. One of his most delicate tasks was managing relations with the press. Reporters from across the country were arriving in San Francisco to cover the disaster. But Funston was concerned that sensationalized reporting might discourage relief efforts or cause panic in other cities. He established a system of press censorship that allowed him to control the flow of information while still keeping the public informed about the situation. Funston's leadership during the earthquake also revealed his understanding of the psychological aspects of disaster management. He made a point of being visible throughout the city, personally inspecting damage, talking to refugees, and coordinating with his officers. His calm presence provided reassurance to both his troops and the civilian population that someone was in control of the situation. The general also demonstrated remarkable foresight in planning for the long-term recovery of the city. Even as fires still burned, he was organizing teams to assess damage, identify critical infrastructure that needed immediate repair, and coordinate with relief organizations to ensure adequate supplies for the refugee camps. This forward-thinking approach helped accelerate the city's eventual rebuilding. But perhaps Funston's most important contribution was his ability to make difficult decisions quickly and decisively. In a crisis where every minute counted, he didn't have the luxury of extensive consultation or careful deliberation. He had to act on incomplete information, knowing that the consequences of inaction might be worse than the risks of taking bold action. Consider his decision to abandon the downtown area to the fires. This meant accepting the destruction of millions of dollars worth of property, including some of the city's most important buildings. But it also meant that his limited firefighting resources could be concentrated on saving residential areas where tens of thousands of people lived. It was a heartbreaking choice, but it was almost certainly the right one. Similarly, his decision to declare martial law and authorize the shooting of looters was harsh by modern standards, but it helped maintain the social order necessary for effective disaster response. In the chaos following the earthquake, with normal law enforcement capabilities destroyed, extreme measures may have been the only way to prevent complete anarchy. As the immediate crisis began to subside after several days of fighting fires and managing refugees, Funston faced the challenge of transitioning from emergency response to long-term recovery. He had to gradually return authority to civilian officials while ensuring that essential services continued to function. This required the same diplomatic skills that had allowed him to work with civilian leaders during the crisis itself. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What historical disaster or topic would you like us to explore next? And thank you for being such an important part of our little corner of the internet. Your support means everything to us as we continue to bring these historical stories to life. Funston's role in the earthquake response wasn't without controversy. Some critics argued that he had overstepped his authority by declaring martial law without proper authorization. Others claimed that his use of dynamite had caused unnecessary destruction. These criticisms would follow him for the rest of his career, but most historians now agree that his quick, decisive action probably saved thousands of lives. The earthquake also revealed Funston's remarkable physical stamina and mental resilience. For days after the disaster, he worked with little sleep, personally coordinating rescue operations, inspecting damaged areas, and managing the complex logistics of caring for hundreds of thousands of refugees. Witnesses described him as tireless, always moving, always thinking, always pushing himself and his subordinates to do more. In the weeks following the earthquake, as the city began the long process of rebuilding, Funston continued to play a crucial role in recovery efforts. He helped coordinate the massive relief operation that brought food, medical supplies, and building materials from across the country. He worked with city planners to ensure that new construction would be more earthquake-resistant, and he helped maintain order as San Francisco slowly transformed from a city of refugees into a functioning community once again. Funston's leadership during the 1906 San Francisco earthquake became a model for civil-military cooperation in disaster response. His ability to work with civilian authorities while maintaining military efficiency influenced how the federal government would respond to future natural disasters. The lessons learned from his experience would be applied in responses to floods, hurricanes, and other catastrophes for decades to come. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Frederick Funston was that he never sought glory or recognition for his role in saving San Francisco. In his official reports and public statements, he consistently emphasized the contributions of his subordinates and the civilian officials who worked with him. He saw himself not as a hero, but as a soldier, doing his duty in extraordinary circumstances. Funston's story reminds us that in times of crisis, leadership often emerges from unexpected places. The small man from Kansas, with his background in botany and his experience fighting in distant wars, proved to have exactly the combination of skills and character needed to save one of America's great cities. His quick thinking, decisive action, and willingness to take responsibility when others hesitated made the difference between a disaster and a complete catastrophe. The earthquake and fire destroyed much of San Francisco, but thanks largely to Funston's leadership, the city survived. Within a few years, it would be rebuilt, more beautiful and more resilient than before. But that rebuilding was possible only because one small general was willing to make hard decisions in the face of impossible circumstances, and because he understood that sometimes saving a city requires being willing to sacrifice parts of it. The human cost of Funston's decisions weighed heavily on him long after the crisis had passed. Years later, in private correspondence, he would write about the sleepless nights he endured, haunted by the faces of people he couldn't save and the buildings he had ordered destroyed. The burden of command during such a catastrophe was something that few people could truly understand. Every decision had life or death consequences, and there was rarely time to consider all the alternatives. One of the most poignant aspects of Funston's leadership was his treatment of the city's most vulnerable populations. San Francisco, in 1906, was a deeply segregated city, with Chinese immigrants confined to Chinatown and other minority groups facing significant discrimination. When the earthquake struck, many expected that military resources would be directed primarily toward saving the wealthy neighborhoods and leaving immigrant communities to fend for themselves. But Funston, to his credit, ordered his troops to assist all residents, regardless of race or nationality. When Chinatown was threatened by the advancing fires, he personally led evacuation efforts, even though many of his officers questioned whether military resources should be used to save what they saw as a dispensable part of the city. Funston's response was characteristically direct. "We're here to save lives, not to make judgments about whose life is worth saving." This principled stance wasn't without political cost. Some of San Francisco's elite criticized Funston for wasting military resources on immigrant populations who they felt should have been left to save themselves. But the general refused to be swayed by such arguments. His military experience had taught him that unit cohesion depended on looking out for everyone, not just those who seemed most important. The general's relationship with the press during the crisis also revealed his sophistication, understanding of public communication. While he established censorship to prevent panic and misinformation, he also recognized the importance of keeping the American people informed about the disaster. He personally briefed reporters each evening, providing carefully measured updates that conveyed the seriousness of the situation without causing despair. Funston understood that the earthquake wasn't just a local crisis, it was a national tragedy that required national support. His press strategy helped ensure that relief supplies and volunteers continued to flow into San Francisco, even as the initial shock of the disaster began to fade from public attention. This sustained support was crucial to the city's long-term recovery. The general's personal sacrifices during the earthquake response were considerable. He had not seen his family for days, had barely slept or eaten, and was showing signs of physical and emotional exhaustion. Several of his subordinates later reported that they were concerned about his health, but Funston refused to step back from his responsibilities even briefly. Perhaps most remarkably, Funston never used his role in the earthquake response for personal advancement. When politicians and military officials praised his leadership, he consistently deflected credit to others. When offered promotions and prestigious assignments based on his earthquake performance, he often declined, preferring to remain focused on his duties rather than pursuing career advancement. The earthquake also revealed Funston's deep love for San Francisco itself. Though he was not a native Californian, he had come to see the city as his adopted home. His determination to save it wasn't just professional duty, it was personal passion. In letters to his wife during the crisis, he wrote about his heartbreak at watching the beautiful city being consumed by flames, and his fierce determination to save whatever could be saved. After the immediate crisis passed, Funston remained involved in the city's rebuilding efforts for months. He helped coordinate the construction of temporary housing for refugees, worked with architects and engineers to develop earthquake-resistant building codes, and assisted in the massive logistical challenge of clearing debris from the streets. His military experience in organizing large-scale operations proved invaluable in managing the complex process of urban reconstruction. As we'll discover in our next segment, the earthquake revealed not just heroes like Funston, but also mysteries and secrets that remain unsolved to this day. The Great Cover-Up. Mysteries and secrets buried in the rubble. In the aftermath of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, something strange happened. As the smoke cleared and the city began to count its dead, a curious pattern emerged in the official records. According to the authorities, only 478 people had died in one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. This number seemed impossibly low to anyone who had witnessed a catastrophe, but it became the official death toll, repeated in newspapers, government reports, and history books for decades. But behind this suspiciously small number lay one of the most extensive cover-ups in American history, a deliberate conspiracy to hide the true scope of the disaster. The earthquake had not only destroyed buildings and claimed lives, it had also exposed secrets that powerful people desperately wanted to keep buried. As we explore deeper into this mystery, we'll discover that the 1906 earthquake revealed corruption, prejudice, and systematic deception that would take historians over a century to fully uncover. The cover-up began within hours of the earthquake. As bodies were pulled from the rubble, they often disappeared before they could be properly counted or identified. Official records were lost, destroyed, or deliberately falsified. Witnesses were discouraged from speaking to reporters, and those who persisted in telling inconvenient truths sometimes found themselves facing legal or economic pressure to remain silent. At the heart of this conspiracy were San Francisco's most powerful business leaders and politicians, many of whom had very practical reasons for wanting to minimize the apparent impact of the earthquake. The city's economy depended heavily on its reputation as a modern, prosperous, and safe place to live and do business. If the true extent of the devastation became widely known, it could discourage investment, immigration, and reconstruction efforts that were essential to the city's recovery. But the motivations for the cover-up went far deeper than simple economic concerns. The earthquake had revealed uncomfortable truths about how San Francisco really worked, exposing a system of corruption, discrimination, and neglect that had made the disaster far worse than it needed to be. Consider, for example, the mysterious case of the missing Chinatown death records. When the earthquake struck, approximately 15,000 Chinese immigrants lived in a densely packed area of wooden buildings that went up like kindling when the fires reached them. Witnesses described scenes of absolute horror as people trapped in collapsed buildings burned alive, unable to escape through the narrow alleyways that had become death traps filled with debris and flames. Yet according to official records, fewer than 50 Chinese residents died in the earthquake. This impossibly low number wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate decision by city officials, who saw an opportunity to literally erase Chinatown from the map. For years, powerful business interests had wanted to relocate the Chinese district to a less valuable area of the city, freeing up valuable real estate near the downtown core for more profitable development. The earthquake gave them the perfect excuse. If the death toll in Chinatown appeared relatively light, it would be easier to argue that the area should be rebuilt elsewhere, or perhaps not rebuilt at all. So bodies were removed from the ruins without being counted, death certificates were never issued, and families who asked about missing relatives were told that no records existed. This systematic erasure of Chinese victims wasn't just about real estate. It reflected the deep-seated racism that pervaded San Francisco society in 1906. Chinese immigrants were seen as temporary residents, not real Americans, so their deaths didn't count in the same way as other casualties. This attitude was so pervasive that even well-meaning relief workers often ignored Chinese refugees when distributing food and medical supplies. The cover-up extended far beyond Chinatown, however. Throughout the city, there was a systematic effort to minimize the apparent death toll by reclassifying earthquake deaths as something else. If someone died from injuries sustained in a building collapse, but didn't actually die until several days later, their death might be attributed to natural causes rather than the earthquake. If someone died in the fires that followed the earthquake, their death was often recorded as a fire fatality rather than an earthquake casualty. This semantic manipulation might seem trivial, but it had enormous implications for how the disaster was remembered and understood. Insurance companies, for example, used these distinctions to avoid paying claims, arguing that their policies covered earthquake damage but not fire damage, or vice versa. The lower death toll also made it easier for city officials to argue that the earthquake hadn't been as serious as it appeared, reducing pressure for expensive safety improvements. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the cover-up involved the systematic destruction of evidence that might contradict the official narrative. Photographs that showed extensive damage were confiscated or destroyed. Newspaper reports that described scenes of mass casualties were censored or suppressed. Even personal letters and diaries that contained first-hand accounts of the disaster sometimes mysteriously disappeared from family archives. The effort to control information about the earthquake extended to scientific research as well. Early seismological studies that might have provided accurate information about the earthquake's magnitude and effects were discouraged or defeated. Scientists who attempted to study the disaster independently found themselves facing institutional pressure to modify their conclusions or abandon their research altogether. One of the most significant mysteries surrounding the earthquake involves the role of the military in suppressing information. General Funston's declaration of martial law gave him broad powers to control communication and movement within the city. And some evidence suggests that these powers were used not just to maintain order, but also to manage the flow of information about the disaster. Military censors reviewed all outgoing telegraph messages and newspaper reports, ostensibly to prevent panic in other cities. But critics argued that this censorship was also used to suppress reports that contradicted the official narrative about the earthquake's impact. Reporters who tried to file stories about mass casualties or extensive damage sometimes found their reports blocked or heavily edited before transmission. The mystery deepens when we examine the earthquake's impact on the city's poorest residents. San Francisco in 1906 was a city of extreme inequality. With magnificent mansions on Nob Hill overlooking squalid tenements in the Mission District and south of Market area. These working-class neighborhoods, built quickly and cheaply to house the city's growing immigrant population, were among the most vulnerable to earthquake damage. Yet official records suggest that these areas suffered relatively light casualties, despite being filled with poorly constructed buildings that should have collapsed catastrophically in a major earthquake. The explanation for this apparent anomaly may lie in the systematic underreporting of deaths among the city's most marginalized residents. Many of the people living in these areas were recent immigrants who spoke little English and had few connections to official institutions. When they died in the earthquake, their deaths often went unrecorded because there was no one to report them and no official mechanism for tracking. Casualties among transient populations, their bodies were buried in mass graves without identification, their names never appearing in any official tally of earthquake victims. This pattern of systematic exclusion extended to other marginalized groups as well. Native Americans, African Americans, and other minority populations were often ignored by relief efforts and excluded from official casualty counts. Their suffering was invisible to the authorities, not because it didn't exist, but because the people in power simply didn't consider their lives worth counting. The economic motivations for the cover-up became clearer as Reconstruction began. San Francisco's business leaders understood that the city's recovery depended on attracting investment and new residents. If the earthquake appeared too devastating, it might discourage people from returning or investing in the rebuilding effort. So they promoted a narrative of resilience and rapid recovery, emphasizing the city's determination to rebuild rather than the extent of the destruction. This narrative was promoted through a sophisticated public relations campaign that included carefully staged photographs, optimistic newspaper stories, and promotional materials that minimized the earthquake's impact. The famous slogan, "San Francisco, the city that knows how," was part of this effort to project confidence and competence in the face of disaster. But the cover-up had serious consequences beyond mere public relations. By minimizing the earthquake's impact, city leaders also minimized the pressure for meaningful reforms that might have prevented similar disasters in the future. Building codes remained inadequate, emergency preparedness was neglected, and the fundamental vulnerabilities that had made the 1906 earthquake so devastating were never properly addressed. The systematic suppression of information about the earthquake also had profound implications for scientific understanding of seismic hazards. For decades, researchers lacked accurate data about the earthquake's effects, making it difficult to develop effective strategies for earthquake prediction and mitigation. This information deficit may have contributed to inadequate preparation for future earthquakes, potentially costing additional lives in subsequent disasters. One of the most intriguing aspects of the earthquake cover-up involves the mysterious disappearance of key documents and records. The earthquake destroyed City Hall and many government offices, but even records that survived the initial disaster often went missing in the months and years that followed. Property records, death certificates, insurance claims, and other documents that might have provided evidence of the earthquake's true impact vanished from archives and filing cabinets. Some of these disappearances may have been accidental, the result of the general chaos and disorganization that followed the disaster. But others appear to have been deliberate, part of a systematic effort to eliminate evidence that contradicted the official narrative. Researchers who have attempted to reconstruct the true story of the earthquake have found suspicious gaps in the historical record, missing documents that should have existed, and archives that have been mysteriously purged of relevant materials. The earthquake also exposed a complex web of political corruption that city leaders were desperate to keep hidden. San Francisco in 1906 was in the midst of a major political scandal involving graft and corruption at the highest levels of city government. The earthquake provided a convenient distraction from these investigations, and some evidence suggests that the disaster response was manipulated to protect powerful individuals who might otherwise have faced criminal charges. Mayor Eugene Schmitz, for example, was under indictment for corruption when the earthquake struck. The disaster gave him an opportunity to appear as a heroic leader managing a crisis, potentially rehabilitating his public image and complicating the legal proceedings against him. Some critics argued that relief efforts were organized in ways that benefited Schmitz's political allies, while disadvantaging his opponents. The insurance industry played a crucial role in the cover-up as well. Most earthquake insurance policies in 1906 contained exclusions for fire damage, while fire insurance policies excluded earthquake damage. This created powerful incentives for insurance companies to argue that damage was caused by whichever peril was not covered by their particular policies. The result was a complex legal battle over the causes of specific damage, with insurance companies hiring investigators to gather evidence that supported their preferred interpretation of events. Some of these investigators went far beyond simply collecting evidence, actively suppressing information that contradicted their company's positions. Witnesses were pressured to change their stories, documents were destroyed, and expert testimony was manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. Perhaps most mysteriously, the earthquake revealed the existence of underground tunnels and chambers beneath San Francisco that had never been officially acknowledged. When buildings collapsed, they sometimes exposed elaborate subterranean networks that appeared to serve purposes beyond simple utility or storage. Some of these spaces contained expensive furnishings, sophisticated ventilation systems, and evidence of regular human occupation. The purpose of these underground facilities remains unclear, but their existence raised uncomfortable questions about what else might be hidden beneath the city. Were they simply basements and storage areas that had been forgotten over time? Or were they part of more elaborate networks serving purposes that powerful people preferred to keep secret? City officials moved quickly to seal off these exposed underground areas, citing safety concerns about unstable structures. But critics argued that the real motivation was to prevent further investigation of spaces that might reveal embarrassing or incriminating information. Whatever secrets these tunnels contained were buried again beneath tons of rubble and new construction. The earthquake also exposed the extent to which San Francisco's official population figures had been inflated for political and economic purposes. When the disaster struck, city boosters claimed that San Francisco was home to over 400,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the United States. But the difficulty of accounting for earthquake refugees suggested that the actual population was significantly smaller. This discrepancy had important implications for federal aid and political representation. Cities with larger populations received more federal funding and political influence, creating incentives to inflate census figures and population estimates. The earthquake made it impossible to maintain these inflated numbers, revealing that San Francisco's political and economic importance had been systematically exaggerated. Modern researchers have used a variety of techniques to try to uncover the truth about the 1906 earthquake, but many mysteries remain unsolved. Archaeological investigations have revealed mass graves that were never officially recorded, containing far more bodies than the official death toll would suggest. Statistical analysis of population changes before and after the earthquake indicates that thousands more people died than were ever officially counted. But the most compelling evidence for a systematic cover-up comes from the gradual emergence of private documents and personal accounts that contradict the official narrative. Family letters, personal diaries, and business records that were hidden away for decades have slowly come to light, revealing a disaster far more devastating than authorities ever admitted. The true death toll from the 1906 San Francisco earthquake will probably never be known with certainty. Modern estimates range from 3,000 to 10,000 fatalities, more than 10 times the official figure. But the exact number is less important than what the cover-up reveals about power, privilege, and the ways that official histories can be manipulated to serve the interests of those who write them. One of the most chilling aspects of the cover-up was the systematic silencing of survivors who attempted to tell their stories. In the weeks and months following the earthquake, people who had witnessed mass casualties or extensive damage began to notice that their accounts were being questioned, dismissed, or actively suppressed. Newspaper editors who had initially published harrowing first-hand testimonies suddenly stopped printing such stories, claiming that they were unverified or potentially harmful to recovery efforts. Survivors who persisted in contradicting the official narrative sometimes faced more direct pressure. Business owners found their credit mysteriously cut off. Workers discovered that they could no longer find employment, and families were told that their applications for relief aid would be delayed indefinitely, unless they stopped spreading rumors about the disaster. This campaign of intimidation was subtle but effective, gradually creating a climate where speaking the truth about the earthquake became financially and socially dangerous. The role of the city's newspapers in perpetuating the cover-up was particularly troubling. In the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, when communications were disrupted and accurate information was scarce, journalists had a unique opportunity to document the true extent of the disaster. Instead, many chose to participate in what amounted to a conspiracy of silence. This wasn't entirely voluntary. Newspaper publishers were deeply embedded in San Francisco's business community, and they understood that their own financial interests were tied to the city's rapid recovery. Sensational reports about mass casualties and extensive damage might sell papers in the short term, but they could also discourage the investment and immigration that the city needed to rebuild. So editors made a calculated decision to prioritize long-term economic interests over journalistic integrity. The result was a systematic distortion of reality that extended far beyond simple underreporting of casualties. Newspapers published carefully staged photographs that showed damage in the best possible light, emphasizing scenes of organized cleanup rather than widespread destruction. They ran stories that focused on acts of heroism and community cooperation, while ignoring reports of panic, chaos, and systemic failures. Perhaps most insidiously, newspapers began to promote the idea that questioning the official earthquake narrative was somehow unpatriotic or harmful to the community. People who insisted that the death toll was higher than reported were characterized as pessimists or troublemakers who were impeding recovery efforts. This rhetorical strategy effectively transformed the search for truth into an act of disloyalty. The cover-up also involved the manipulation of photographic evidence in ways that were remarkably sophisticated for 1906. Photographers were often prevented from accessing areas where damage was most severe, or they were guided to specific locations that presented the disaster in a more favorable light. Some photographs that showed extensive casualties or damage were confiscated by military authorities and never returned to their owners. Even more troubling, there is evidence that some photographs were deliberately altered before publication. Images of mass graves were cropped to show fewer bodies. Pictures of collapsed buildings were manipulated to make the damage appear less severe, and photographs of refugee camps were staged to suggest better conditions than actually existed. These alterations were subtle enough that they weren't immediately obvious to viewers, but they cumulatively created a false impression of the earthquake's impact. The international implications of the cover-up were also significant. San Francisco in 1906 was one of America's most important Pacific ports, serving as a gateway for trade with Asia and a symbol of American prosperity and technological achievement. If the earthquake appeared too devastating, it could damage America's international reputation and potentially affect diplomatic and economic relationships with other countries. Foreign diplomats and journalists who visited San Francisco in the aftermath of the earthquake were given carefully orchestrated tours that emphasized signs of recovery while avoiding areas where destruction was most evident. International news reports about the earthquake were often based on official press releases rather than independent investigation, further perpetuating the distorted narrative about the disaster's impact. The religious community also played a complex role in the cover-up, though often for different reasons than business and political leaders. Many churches and religious organizations were heavily involved in relief efforts, and they were reluctant to publicize information that might discourage charitable donations from other parts of the country. Additionally, some religious leaders believed that emphasizing the earthquake's devastating effects might be seen as questioning God's mercy or the community's faith. This created a situation where even well-intentioned people participated in suppressing accurate information about the disaster. Church records that might have provided valuable information about casualties and relief efforts were often incomplete or deliberately vague. Religious leaders, who privately knew that the official death toll was far too low, rarely spoke publicly about their concerns. The cover-up's impact on scientific understanding of earthquakes was particularly damaging. Accurate data about the 1906 earthquake's effects was crucial for developing better building codes, emergency response procedures, and geological understanding of seismic hazards. By suppressing this information, the cover-up potentially contributed to inadequate preparation for future earthquakes, not just in San Francisco, but throughout California and other seismically active regions. Seismologists and geologists who attempted to study the earthquake found their research complicated by the lack of reliable data. Official records were incomplete or contradictory, witness accounts were suppressed or discredited, and physical evidence was often removed or altered before it could be properly documented. This made it difficult to develop accurate models of earthquake behavior or to identify the specific factors that had made the 1906 earthquake so destructive. As we move into our final segment, we'll explore how the earthquake's impact extended far beyond San Francisco itself, revealing the hidden world of California's elite and the extraordinary measures they took to protect their wealth and status in the face of unprecedented disaster. The Golden Sanctuary: how California's elite survived while others perished. While ordinary San Franciscans struggled to survive in refugee camps and makeshift shelters, a very different story was unfolding in the exclusive enclaves, where California's wealthiest families made their homes. The 1906 earthquake revealed not just the fault lines running through the earth beneath San Francisco, but also the deep social divisions that separated the city's elite from everyone else. For those with sufficient wealth and connections, the disaster became not a test of survival, but an opportunity to demonstrate the extraordinary privileges that money could buy, even in the face of nature's most devastating forces. The contrast could not have been more stark. While hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens huddled in Golden Gate Park under canvas tents, eating whatever relief food they could obtain, California's richest families retreated to private estates, exclusive clubs, and luxury hotels that had somehow escaped the earthquake's worst effects. These weren't just lucky survivors. They were members of a social class that had developed sophisticated systems for protecting themselves from exactly the kind of catastrophe that was devastating their less fortunate neighbors. Consider the experience of the railroad barons, mining magnates, and banking dynasties who had built their fortunes during California's boom years. Families like the Crockers, the Huntingtons, and the Hopkins had not simply accumulated wealth. They had used that wealth to create parallel infrastructures that functioned independently of the city's public systems. When the earthquake knocked out San Francisco's water supply, these families had private wells and storage tanks. When the city's food distribution system collapsed, they had private stockpiles and dedicated supply chains. When public transportation failed, they had private carriages, automobiles, and even boats ready to spirit them away from danger. The earthquake struck at 5:12 in the morning, but by 6 a.m., less than an hour after the initial shock, private trains were already being prepared to evacuate the families of the city's wealthiest residents. These weren't public transportation options available to ordinary citizens. They were specially chartered trains with private cars, staffed by personal servants and stocked with luxury provisions. While most San Franciscans were still trying to dig themselves out of collapsed buildings or flee advancing fires on foot, the elite was settling into comfortable railway compartments for leisurely journeys to country estates and resort hotels far from the disaster zone. The The level of advanced planning that went into these evacuation arrangements was remarkable. Wealthy families hadn't simply hoped that they would be able to escape if disaster struck. They had developed detailed contingency plans that anticipated exactly the kind of catastrophe that the earthquake represented. Private agreements with railroad companies ensured that special trains would be available at a moment's notice. Arrangements with banks guaranteed access to cash and credit even if San Francisco's financial institutions were destroyed. Contracts with suppliers promised that food, clothing, and other necessities would be delivered wherever the families chose to relocate. But perhaps most importantly, these families had cultivated relationships with officials and institutions that gave them privileged access to information and resources. During the crisis, while ordinary citizens struggled to get accurate information about the earthquake's effects or the availability of relief services, the elite had direct lines of communication with military commanders, government officials, and business leaders who could provide real-time updates and special assistance. General Funston, for all his democratic principles in rescue operations, found himself under considerable pressure to provide special protection for the city's most prominent families. These weren't just requests for preferential treatment. They were carefully orchestrated campaigns that leveraged political connections, financial relationships, and social obligations to ensure that military resources were directed toward protecting elite interests. The Nob Hill Mansions, home to many of San Francisco's wealthiest families, were among the few residential areas where military units were specifically assigned to fight fires and prevent looting. While working-class neighborhoods were essentially abandoned to the flames, soldiers worked tirelessly to save the elaborate Victorian palaces that housed the city's aristocracy. When these efforts ultimately failed, and many of the mansions burned anyway, the wealthy families had already been safely evacuated, taking with them not just their personal possessions, but also valuable artwork, documents, and family heirlooms that represented generations of accumulated wealth. The exclusive Pacific Union Club, one of San Francisco's most prestigious social institutions, became an informal command center for coordinating the evacuation and protection of elite families. Club members who had survived the initial earthquake gathered there to share information, coordinate assistance for one another, and plan their responses to the crisis. The club's extensive wine cellar was converted into a temporary storage facility for valuable documents and small treasures, while its dining rooms served as meeting spaces where the wealthy could plan their next moves in comfort and privacy. But the true extent of elite privilege during the earthquake became apparent in the days and weeks that followed the initial disaster. While most San Franciscans faced months or even years of uncertainty about their future prospects, the wealthy families were able to begin rebuilding their lives almost immediately. Private banks that had been destroyed in the earthquake were quickly re-established in temporary quarters, with special arrangements to ensure that elite clients had immediate access to their funds. Insurance companies, which were denying claims and delaying payments for ordinary policyholders, somehow found ways to expedite settlements for their wealthiest clients. Property that had been completely destroyed was often revalued and rebuilt within months, while working-class neighborhoods remained rubble-strewn wastelands for years. The disparity in recovery times wasn't accidental. It reflected a systematic prioritization of elite interests that permeated every aspect of the post-earthquake reconstruction effort. The wealthy families also had access to alternative accommodations that were simply unavailable to ordinary citizens, while refugees crowded into military tents and makeshift shelters. The elite retreated to country estates, luxury hotels in other cities, and exclusive resorts that offered all the comforts of home. Some families simply relocated to their second or third homes, experiencing the earthquake as little more than an inconvenient disruption to their normal routines. The Hearst family, for example, whose newspaper empire would play a crucial role in shaping public perception of the earthquake, had multiple residences scattered throughout California and beyond. When the earthquake struck, they simply activated contingency plans that had been in place for years, moving seamlessly from their San Francisco mansion to equally luxurious accommodations elsewhere. For them, the earthquake was a logistical challenge to be managed, not a survival crisis to be endured. The level of luxury that the elite maintained even during the immediate aftermath of the disaster was almost surreal. Private chefs continued to prepare elaborate meals. Personal servants maintained normal schedules of service, and social activities continued with only minor adjustments for the changed circumstances. Some wealthy families held dinner parties and social gatherings within days of the earthquake, treating the disaster as an interesting topic of conversation rather than a life-altering catastrophe. This wasn't mere callousness, though there was certainly an element of that involved. It reflected a fundamentally different relationship to risk and security that wealth made possible. While ordinary citizens were entirely dependent on public infrastructure and services that the earthquake had destroyed, the wealthy had created private alternatives that functioned independently of the city's systems. When public systems failed, their private systems continued to operate smoothly. The earthquake also revealed the extent to which California's elite had developed international networks that could provide assistance during domestic crises. Wealthy families with business interests in Asia, Europe, and other parts of the United States were able to draw on resources and connections from around the world. Money was transferred from foreign accounts. Business associates provided temporary accommodations and assistance, and international social networks offered support that was entirely unavailable to ordinary Americans. Some of the most prominent families used the earthquake as an opportunity to relocate permanently to more fashionable cities like New York, London, or Paris. The disaster provided a convenient excuse to abandon San Francisco for more cosmopolitan locations, while maintaining their California business interests through hired managers and local representatives. For these families, the earthquake wasn't a catastrophe that destroyed their lives. It was a catalyst that accelerated plans they had been considering anyway. The contrast between elite and ordinary experiences during the earthquake extended to every aspect of daily life. While most San Franciscans struggled to find clean water, adequate food, and basic shelter, wealthy families enjoyed imported wine, gourmet cuisine, and luxury accommodations, while ordinary citizens faced uncertainty about their jobs, their homes, and their futures. The elite were already making plans for rebuilding that assumed unlimited access to capital, labor, and materials. This disparity was particularly evident in the medical care available to different social classes during and after the earthquake. While public hospitals were overwhelmed or destroyed, leaving most injured people with little or no medical attention, wealthy families had access to private physicians who provided house calls and personalized care. Some elite families even hired private trains to transport injured family members to hospitals in other cities, ensuring access to the best possible medical treatment. The social dynamics within the refugee camps also reflected these class differences. While most displaced San Franciscans were crowded into military tents with minimal privacy and basic amenities, wealthy families who found themselves temporarily in the camps were often provided with special accommodations. They received larger tents, better food, more privacy, and preferential access to whatever services were available. But perhaps most revealing was how quickly the elite were able to re-establish their social institutions and cultural activities. Within weeks of the earthquake, Exclusive clubs were meeting in temporary quarters. Private schools were resuming classes in makeshift facilities, and social events were being organized for wealthy families who had weathered the crisis. While most of the city remained in ruins, the infrastructure of elite society was already being rebuilt and reinforced. The earthquake also provided opportunities for some wealthy families to increase their power and influence. Properties that had been damaged or destroyed could be purchased at reduced prices from desperate sellers. Business competitors who had been ruined by the disaster could be acquired or eliminated. The chaos and disruption that devastated ordinary citizens created investment opportunities for those with sufficient capital to take advantage of them. Real estate speculation in the aftermath of the earthquake was particularly aggressive. Wealthy investors, often working through intermediaries to hide their involvement, purchased damaged properties throughout the city at fraction of their pre-earthquake values. These properties were then rebuilt and resold at enormous profits or held for long-term appreciation as the city recovered. This speculative activity contributed to the housing shortage that plagued ordinary San Franciscans for years after the earthquake. The labor market also shifted dramatically in favor of wealthy employers. With so many workers displaced, injured, or killed in the earthquake, those who needed jobs were willing to accept much lower wages and worse working conditions than had been standard before the disaster. Wealthy families and businesses took advantage of this desperation to reduce their labor costs and eliminate workers who had been involved in union organizing or other activities that threatened elite interests. The reconstruction of San Francisco reflected these class dynamics as well. While working-class neighborhoods were rebuilt slowly and often with substandard materials and construction techniques, elite areas received immediate attention from the best architects, engineers, and craftsmen available. The new mansions that rose from the ashes of Nob Hill were even more elaborate and luxurious than their predecessors. While tenements and working-class housing remained overcrowded, poorly constructed, and vulnerable to future disasters. Educational opportunities also reflected the continuing class divide. While public schools struggled to resume operations with limited resources and damaged facilities, private schools serving wealthy families quickly re-established themselves with full funding and superior accommodations. Children from elite families continued their education with minimal disruption, while working-class children often saw their schooling interrupted for months or years. The cultural institutions that served San Francisco's elite were also prioritized during Reconstruction. New opera houses, exclusive clubs, and luxury hotels were among the first major buildings to be rebuilt, often with enhanced facilities and greater luxury than before. Meanwhile, public libraries, community centers, and other institutions that served ordinary citizens remained closed or operated out of temporary facilities for years. The earthquake revealed that California's elite lived essentially in a different world from their fellow citizens, one where natural disasters were manageable inconveniences rather than existential threats. This parallel society, with its private infrastructure, exclusive networks, and unlimited resources, allowed wealthy families to not just survive the earthquake, but to emerge from it stronger and more powerful than before. The most striking aspect of this elite response to the earthquake was how completely it was hidden from public view. While newspapers documented the suffering of ordinary citizens and celebrated examples of democratic cooperation and mutual aid, they rarely mentioned the very different experiences of wealthy families. This wasn't accidental. It was part of a deliberate effort to maintain the myth that the earthquake had affected all San Franciscans equally. The reality was quite different. The earthquake had revealed and reinforced the deep inequalities that defined San Francisco society. creating a two-tier recovery process that ensured that wealth and privilege would be preserved and enhanced, while ordinary citizens struggled to rebuild their lives from nothing. The disaster that devastated most of the city became an opportunity for the elite to consolidate their power and secure their position for generations to come. As the fires finally died down and the immediate crisis passed, San Francisco began the long process of rebuilding. But the city that emerged from the ashes wasn't the same San Francisco that had been destroyed. It was a city where the lessons of the earthquake had been carefully studied and absorbed by those with the power to shape its future, ensuring that the next time disaster struck, they would be even better prepared to protect their interests, while others faced the consequences of living without such protections. This, perhaps, is the most sobering lesson of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Natural disasters may appear to be great equalizers, striking rich and poor alike without regard for social status or political connections. But the reality is that wealth and privilege provide powerful protection even against the forces of nature. While the earth itself may not discriminate, human society certainly does, and those differences become most apparent precisely when they matter most. The psychological impact of witnessing such extreme inequality during a time of universal crisis had lasting effects on San Francisco's social fabric. Working-class survivors who had lost everything watched wealthy families maintaining their luxurious lifestyles just miles away, creating a sense of betrayal and disillusionment that would influence the city's politics for decades to come. Many began to question the fundamental fairness of a system that could provide such dramatically different outcomes for people facing the same natural disaster. This growing awareness of class inequality contributed to the rise of labor organizing and progressive political movements in post-earthquake San Francisco. Workers who had seen their wealthy employers evacuated to safety, while they were left to face the fires, began to demand not just better wages and working conditions, but fundamental changes to the power structures that had made such disparities possible. The earthquake had inadvertently created a generation of activists who understood viscerally how wealth translated into survival advantages. The elite's response to this growing unrest was characteristically sophisticated. Rather than simply relying on force to suppress dissent, wealthy families invested heavily in public relations campaigns designed to reshape the narrative about their earthquake experiences. They funded charitable organizations, sponsored public works projects, and promoted stories that emphasized their own suffering and sacrifice during the crisis. These efforts were remarkably successful in obscuring the true extent of elite privilege during the earthquake. Within a few years, the dominant narrative portrayed the disaster as a great democratizing experience that had brought all San Franciscans together regardless of class or background. The reality of private trains, exclusive shelters, and preferential treatment was gradually erased from public memory, replaced by carefully crafted stories of shared hardship and mutual cooperation. The wealthy families also used their earthquake experiences to justify and expand their existing privileges. They argued that their quick recovery and continued prosperity demonstrated their superior character and management skills, while the ongoing struggles of working-class families proved their inherent weakness and moral failings. This narrative conveniently ignored the role that pre-existing wealth and resources had played in determining different recovery outcomes. Perhaps most cynically, some elite families actually profited from promoting themselves as earthquake heroes. They published memoirs and gave lectures about their experiences, carefully edited to emphasize their courage and generosity while omitting details about their private advantages. These accounts were widely circulated and became part of the official historical record, further cementing the false narrative about the earthquake's democratic impact. The international implications of elite earthquake privilege extended far beyond San Francisco itself. Wealthy families who had relocated to other countries during the crisis often remained there permanently, taking their capital and connections with them. This brain drain and capital flight slowed San Francisco's recovery and reduced the resources available for rebuilding working-class neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the elite families who did return to San Francisco often brought with them new ideas and technologies they had encountered during their temporary exile. These innovations were typically implemented first in wealthy neighborhoods, creating even greater disparities between elite and working-class areas of the rebuilt city. The earthquake thus became a catalyst for accelerating inequality rather than reducing it. The legal system also reflected and reinforced these class differences. Wealthy families had access to the best lawyers and could navigate the complex legal challenges that arose from earthquake damage, insurance claims, and property disputes. They were able to protect their interests through the courts, while ordinary citizens often found themselves unable to afford legal representation or understand the complex proceedings that determined their fate. The insurance industry's differential treatment of claims based on social class was particularly egregious. While wealthy policyholders received prompt settlements and favorable interpretations of their coverage, working-class families often found their claims denied on technical grounds or delayed for years while companies investigated. This disparity wasn't accidental, but reflected the insurance industry's understanding that wealthy clients had the resources to take their business elsewhere, while ordinary customers had few alternatives. The earthquake also revealed the extent to which California's elite had developed what amounted to a shadow government that operated parallel to official institutions. During the crisis, decisions about resource allocation, evacuation priorities, and reconstruction plans were often made not by elected officials, but by informal networks of wealthy families and business leaders. These shadow governance structures ensured that elite interests were protected even when official government functions were disrupted. The long-term consequences of these earthquake-era inequalities shaped San Francisco's development for generations. The wealthy families who had survived and prospered during the crisis used their enhanced position to influence city planning, educational policy, and economic development in ways that perpetuated their advantages. The San Francisco that emerged from Reconstruction was not just rebuilt. It was redesigned to better serve elite interests, while marginalizing the needs of ordinary citizens. This legacy of earthquake privilege helps explain why San Francisco developed into one of America's most economically segregated cities, with extreme wealth concentrated in certain neighborhoods, while poverty persisted in others. The 1906 earthquake didn't create these inequalities, but it provided opportunities for the wealthy to institutionalize and expand their advantages in ways that would prove remarkably durable. If this helped you relax and learn something new, gently tap that subscribe button for more sleepy disasters every week. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're safe in your bed, unlike the people we just learned about. Sleep well.